Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Top3Tech. Today we're going to bring you another GPU review, and today's card is going to be the PNY XLR8 Gaming. It's a 3060. It's been a while since I had an Nvidia card on here. I've never had a PNY product before unless you count like thumb drives. So I'm excited to see how this card does. Its reputation, people usually say not to buy them, or I feel like it has a bad reputation, but we're going to see how it tests. I mean, its name is XLR8 Gaming. It has to do good, right? But this was $600 at Best Buy. I probably wouldn't recommend it at that price. I feel like you could save a little bit more and get a higher tier card. But if the prices are different, let's just ignore that part and let's see how this card does. First, we're going to check it out of the box. Take it out. This thing, look how tiny it is. We'll take it out of the box, do an open box review, check the contents inside, and then we'll do the benchmarks. So let's dive into it, you guys. Ahead and open her up. I guess before we do, look at the size differences between these boxes. But let's check her out. See what comes with this bad boy. Fancy little box. Oh my goodness, isn't that crazy? That's it. Just the anti-static bag, and there's nothing else in there. Kind of a rip-off. $600 for this card, and it doesn't even come with any extras. It says, caution, the electrostatic sensitive devices do not open or work on unless you're in a static-free workplace. Gosh, this sticker comes off terribly too. Sorry guys. Terrible. So that folds over like this. I mean, here's a quick look at it. Let's take a deeper dive into it. We have a single fan on the card. The GPU measures 6.5 inches in length, or 17 millimeters for everyone else around the world. Since this is the only fan edition of this card, you do get to see it nude. It has no backplate on it. The heat pipes make this card come alive when you compare it to the plasticky look of the rest of it. Not a big fan of that, but hey, what can you do? This is supposed to be a budget card, right? But hey, at least they didn't cheap out on the RGB, because this GeForce RTX does light up with their Epic X RGB software. This card does come equipped with 3 1.4 display ports and one HDMI 2.1 slot. So I gave a quick description about it right now during the zoom in, but as you can see, I have the 6800 XT to compare it to, the special edition, and then this is just the 3060 Accelerate Gaming. That one does have 3 fans. This one only has 1 fan, an only fan, I guess you could say. I don't know if I would subscribe to it though, but look at the difference between the cards. It's about half the size. I mean, geez, this front plastic looks pretty funky as it is. This one has like a nicer premium finish to it. It's kind of unfair to compare the two. There's a big price difference, but nonetheless, we'll compare them. I mean, this looks kind of nice. It is that 8-pin that stated previously, but look at this right there. The RGB lights up. This lights up right here. No backplate, which is unfortunate. I mean, look at that compared to this. I'm already not a big fan of that. This is the first next gen card I got in that doesn't have the backplate, so that's unfortunate. I mean, as you compare these two, the only difference on this one is it has the USB Type-C and less display ports, but it's got the little heat radiators there. I don't see no vent on the back. All these cards have vents on them, but I guess it doesn't need it since it's only a single fan, maybe. But I don't even know how this will look like in the gonna look like in the PC. So there it is inside the PC. I mean, geez, my GPU bracket, pretty much there's no point to it right now. Look how tiny that thing is. No backplate, single fan. I mean, I guess let's see how it looks like with RGB on. I mean, that's how it looks like lit up. At least the GeForce RTX looks nice, but geez, look. All that space in there. I have to get a bigger bottle of Hennessy if I get this card. And sorry if I already seem skeptical. I'm trying to be unbiased, but this is the open box review. This is the physical review. And so far, this is probably the worst looking card I have reviewed. So I don't mean to be cynical, but this is it. But let's see how the benchmark results come out. I mean, hopefully those impress. Alright, whether you watched through the whole video or you skipped through here, we are now going into the benchmarks. Before I proceed, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to the Top3Tech PC specs. So inside of my PC, we have an Asus X570 Tough Gaming plus Wi-Fi. We have a Ryzen 7 5800X. We got 32 gigabytes of Corsair Vengeance, 3200 megahertz RAM. And of course, we have the PNY Accelerate Gaming REVEL. I'm just going to call it REVEL, the RTX 3060. It has 1777 megahertz boost clock. The core clock is 1320 megahertz. It has 12 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory. It is running on the Ampere architecture. And the recommended minimum wattage is 550 watt PSU. So if you got that going, you're all good. The first benchmark that we're going to run today is the TimeSpy 3D Mark. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT leads the group with a 16632 TimeSpy score and the GPU score of 18,431. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 comes in second with 14,294 TimeSpy score and a GPU score of 15,177. The Asus ROG Strix 6700 XT leads the way of the 6700 XTs at 13,031 TimeSpy score and a GPU score of 13,406. The Sapphire Pulse 6700 XT is in last place of the 6700 XTs with 11,386 TimeSpy score and 11,542 GPU score. we have the MSI Gaming X 6600 XT with 9,905 time spy score and a GPU score of 9,853. And of course, we have the PNY XLR8 Gaming REVEL 3060 with a time spy score of 8,830 and a GPU score of 8,478. We move on to the Firestrike 3D Mark Benchmark. It has the Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT in first place with a 37,708 Firestrike score, a GPU score of 53,175. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 comes in second with 34,251 Firestrike score and a GPU score of 44,216. Leading the way in the 6700 XT category is the Asus ROG Strix with a 30,583 Firestrike score and a 36,790 GPU score. And then on the bottom of the 6700 XT group is the Sapphire Pulse with a Firestrike score of 28,134 and a GPU score of 33,481. The MSI Gaming X 6600 XT has a 25,868 Firestrike score and a 29,211 GPU score. And the PNY XLR8 Gaming REVEL 3060 has a 20,662 Firestrike score and a 21,965 GPU score. Oh, and I'm sorry, and the time spy score, the hottest it got was 72 degrees Celsius, and the Firestrike score or benchmark, the hottest it got was 72 degrees Celsius as well. Single fan, so not too bad. We move on to the MSI Kombuster 1440p benchmark. The card maxed out at 73 degrees Celsius. And the EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 got first place with 66 frames per second. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT got 51 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 got 43 frames per second. The XFX Merc 319 6700 XT led that group at 39 frames per second. But the PNY the XLR8 Gaming REVEL 3060 got 38 frames per second. And then if we go back to the 6700 XT group, the Power Color Hellhound came in last with 36 frames per second. Then we move down to the MSI Gaming X 5700 XT at 35 frames per second. And then we have the MSI Gaming X 6600 XT at 31 frames per second. When we test out the 3060 with the MSI Kombuster 1080p, the max temp that it got was 73 degrees Celsius. The EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 led the way with 80 frames per second. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT came in second with 57 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 got 49 frames per second. The PNY XLR8 Gaming REVEL 3060 got 46 frames per second. Beating out the 6700 XT group, the XFX Merc 319 led the way in that group with 44 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 5700 XT had 41 frames per second. The Asus ROG Strix 6700 XT came in last in that group with 37 frames per second. And the MSI Gaming X 6600 XT had 36 frames per second. We go to the next round of benchmarks. We test out Gears 5 Ultra Preset benchmark at 1440p. The max temperature that this card got was 71 degrees Celsius. And we start off with the Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT with 120.8 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 got 95 frames per second. The Asus ROG Strix leads the 6700 XT group with 90.4 frames per second. And then we hop down to the the XFX Merc 319 6700 XT with 77 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 5700 XT has 71 frames per second. The EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 had 70.6 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 6600 XT had 66.6 frames per second. And the PNY XLR8 Gaming REVEL had 62.1 frames per second. It came in last on that one. The 3060 at the 1080p settings, the max temperature the card hit was 70 degrees Celsius. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT had 142.9 frames per second. The Asus ROG Strix 6700 XT had 129.7 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 had 124.8 when I tested it. This is when the card originally came out. The Adrenaline updates might have better performance now, but the next 6700 XT on the list, well, I guess in last place would be the XFX Merc 319 at 108.7 frames per second. Then we have the MSI Gaming X 6600 XT at 101.9 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 5700 XT had 98 frames per second. The PNY XLR8 Gaming REVEL 3060 was at 82.7 frames per second, beating out the EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 at 81 frames per second. The only thing I can guess is it's a 1080p card, so maybe it does better at that, huh? I'm not too sure of that result, but that's the user benchmark that is in the game, so there's no user error on my end. Okay, the next benchmark is Forza Horizon 4 Ultra at 1440p. The 3060 maxed out at 69 degrees Celsius testing this out. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT came in at 241.5 frames per second. The Asus ROG Strix 6700 XT had 178.7 frames per second. That's leading the 6700 XT group. It's probably going to bounce around a little bit, but as I hop down to the Sapphire Pulse 6800, it was at 173.6 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800, the ASRock Phantom Gaming, and the XFX Merc 6700 XT, those are on older drivers, so I'm gonna have to retest them again if I could get my hands on them. But we go down to the EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070. It has 154.9 frames per second. Right under that is the MSI Gaming X 6600 XT at 151.2 frames per second. And then in last place was the ASRock Phantom Gaming XFX Merc 319 for the 6700 XTs at 138.2 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 5700 XT had 126 frames per second. And then the PNY XLR8 Gaming REVEL 3060 came in last again at 109.4 frames per second. So we go to the Forza Horizon 4 Ultra preset benchmark at 1080p. The 3060's highest temperature hit 68 degrees Celsius while testing the card. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT led the way with 286.6 frames per second. The Asus ROG Strix 6700 XT had 225.8 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 had 207.3 frames per second. Right under that was the MSI Gaming X 6600 XT with 207.3 frames per 202.1 frames per second. The EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 had 178.6 frames per second. The XFX Merc 319 6700 XT came in last of that group with 166.2 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 5700 XT had 160 frames per second. And then, of course, the PNY XLR8 Gaming REVEL 3060 came in last at 136.4 frames per second. This is where things get interesting. So we're going to introduce DLSS to the lineup. I would definitely recommend DLSS for Call of Duty Cold War. The frames go up and the graphics take a slight dip. Like, it's not even noticeable to me. So I would definitely recommend it, and we're going to dive into it right now. So the Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT had 131 frames per second. The EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 had 91 frames per second. With DLSS on, it had 118 frames per second. I would definitely recommend DLSS on for this game. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 had 108 frames per second. The Asus ROG Strix 6700 XT had 99 frames per second, leading the group of the 6700 XTs. The PNY XLR8 Gaming REVEL 3060 had 67 frames per second. It would have been pretty much last, but with DLSS, it had 92 frames per second, tying the 6700 XTs or in between them pretty much. The last of the 6700 XTs was the XFX Merc 319 with 86 frames per second. We had the MSI Gaming X 5700 XT with 72 frames per second. We had the MSI Gaming X 6600 XT with 56 frames per second. So the 3060 at max temp on 1080p was 71 degrees. And let's see how the Cold War Ultra campaign at 1080p went. So the EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 led the way at 129 frames per second, but with DLSS on, it boosted up to 161. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT had 156. The Power Color Red Devil 6700 XT had 146. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 had 139. And then we go through the 6700 XT groups, and towards the end of it, we have the PNY XLR8 Gaming REVEL 3060 with 93 frames per second. With the LSS on, it had 116 frames per second. We go down to the MSI Gaming X 5700 XT that had 94 frames per second, and the MSI Gaming X 6600 XT had 75 frames per second. So that's how that compares. Like I said, I would recommend DLSS on because it would have been second to last if without it. We go to Call of Duty Warzone, everything on high settings, 1440p. I do not use DLSS on here because when it first came out, it was super buggy, so I didn't try it. And since I didn't try it then, I'm not trying it now. The 3060 temperature maxed out at 71 degrees Celsius. And the Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT had 166 frames per second. The Asus ROG Strix 6700 XT had 164 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 had 153 frames per second. And then the EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 had 140 frames per second. The Sapphire Nitro Plus 6700 XT came in last of the 6700 XTs at 134 frames per second. MSI Gaming X 6600 XT had 121 frames per second. MSI Gaming X 5700 XT had 112 frames per second. And then the PNY XLR8 Gaming REVEL 3060 came in last at 108 frames per second. The 3060 maxed out at 65 degrees Celsius at 1080p, which is what we're at right now. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 had 180 frames, but I believe that was probably wrong. I have to retest that one of these days. The Asus ROG Strix 6700 XT had 171 frames per second. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT had 169 frames per second. We go down to the MSI Gaming X 5700 XT in the middle of the 6700 XTs at 157 frames per second. Under that is the EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 at 147 frames per second. The Power Color Hellhound 6700 XT is in between those at 146 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 6600 XT had 144 frames per second. The Sapphire Nitro Plus 6700 XT is the last of the 6700 XT group at 140 frames per second. And then the last card was the PNY XLR8 Gaming REVEL 3060 at 120 frames per second. So Warzone has different variables. It's kind of hard to test it because it's always random, but I mean, this is the best I got. This one is more of a guideline of anything. And for the last test, we have Cyberpunk Ultra preset at 1440p. The 3060 hit a max of 75 degrees Celsius. This is a demanding game. It is a perfect game to test these cards because it is pretty much a next-gen game. The graphics are high and it has DLSS, so we get the best of everything. But the Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT got 83 frames per second. The EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 had 55 frames per second. With DLSS on, it had 83 frames, tying the 6800 XT. I recommend DLSS in this game as well. It looks great. Frames go up. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 had 64 frames per second. And leading the 6700 XT group is the Sapphire Nitro Plus with 57 frames per second. And it takes us all the way down to the Asus ROG Strix 6700 XT. That one got 47 frames per second. The PNY XLR8 Gaming REVEL 3060 got 32 frames per second, but with DLSS on, it had 44 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 5700 XT had 40 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 6600 XT had 32 frames per second. So we hop on over to the Cyberpunk Ultra preset 1080p. The card maxed out at 74 degrees Celsius. And then the Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT had 91 frames per second. The Sapphire Nitro Plus 6700 XT had 83 frames per second. The EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 had 71 frames per second. With the LSS on, it had 81 frames per second. We go down to the Sapphire Pulse 6800, had 78 frames per second. The last of the 6700s was the Power Color Hellhound with 73 frames per second. We have the PNY Accelerate Gaming REVEL 3060 at 51 frames per second. With DLSS on, it had 69 frames per second. MSI Gaming X 5700 XT had 62 frames per second, and the MSI Gaming X 6600 XT had 60 frames per second. So, we're at the conclusion of the video. This is the top 3 tech review of the 3060, the PNY Accelerate Gaming REVEL. I don't know, on the card it just says Accelerate Gaming. So, I don't know where REVEL comes from. It is the single fan. So, the pros, I guess, since it's a single fan, it can fit in a mini ITX case. That's the pro. It could fit in a smaller case. You don't want to take up too much desk space, or you have a small PC case you've been wanting to use. It's pretty good for that. If you're gonna game it at 1080p, maybe 60 hertz monitor, it'd be good for that too. You could probably lower the settings and get higher frames. Remember, this is all tested at ultra, but I mean, I don't know if there's too much pros for that for me. I mean, the cons is the price. It was $600. If I would probably recommend it at $200, $300. If it ever goes down, I would probably assume that $300 will be the lowest it ever goes. This is just going off GPU prices. But it's pretty hard to recommend the card at that price point. I mean, you've seen the results. It's pretty much last in every single test. I mean, another pro is the DLSS. With DLSS on, it actually did a little bit better. But you're barely hitting 60 frames at 1080p, and you're barely hitting 30 frames at 1440p, if that. So I would say it's a pass. I mean, looking at it aesthetically, it doesn't look nice either to me. It has no backplate, so I mean, I would not recommend the card, but if it's on sale one day, maybe it'd be a good deal. I'm not too sure, but you know, so it didn't pass on the looks, it didn't pass on the performance, and it didn't pass on price. So I'm gonna go ahead and say skip this card and get something else. I hope you guys had a good day, and remember to tune in to Top 3 Tech. Peace. Thank you for watching another video from Top 3 Entertainment. I hope you hit like and subscribe. Also, I'm going to have a recommended playlist, a recommended video right here, so make sure to click that as well. I appreciate you guys tuning in, whether it be to the Top 3 Tech, Top 3 Gaming, or the Why Not Me podcast. You guys are dope. I hope to see you guys in the next video. And of course, let's grow this thing together. Peace. Peace. Peace.